Some memories never fade. They have fur, bright eyes, and the gift of loving us without saying a word. Because every dog carries a story, and maybe a part of yours. Get ready to discover more than a breed. Discover a lifelong companion.
The cold December wind of 2010 blew against the windows of the psychology laboratory at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Inside, the heating kept the environment comfortable, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Scientists from 3 different universities had traveled there to witness something many considered impossible, a test that could redefine everything we knew about animal intelligence. In the center of the room, a 6-year-old Border Collie named Chaser sat calmly. Her deep brown eyes watched attentively as her handler, psychology professor Dr. John Pilley, an 82-year-old man with white hair and a gentle smile that concealed a rigorous scientific mind. Around them, scattered across the floor, were literally over 1,000 objects, toys of every imaginable type, size, and color. Teddy bears, balls, frisbees, ropes, blocks, dolls, a collection that had taken 3 years to accumulate. "We're ready to begin," announced Dr. Bay. Alliston Reed, the psychologist who would oversee the test, he had prepared a randomized list of objects selected by computer from the 1,022 items that Chaser supposedly knew by name. The first word on the list was Darwin. Dr. Pilley knelt beside Chaser, gently placed his hand on her head, and said in a clear voice, "Chaser, find Darwin. Where's Darwin?" What happened next made everyone in the room hold their breath. Chaser didn't hesitate. She didn't sniff randomly. She didn't look for visual cues from her owner. She simply stood up, walked directly through the sea of toys, passing hundreds of other objects, and stopped in front of a small, purple, stuffed monkey. Gently, she picked it up with her mouth and brought it back to Pilley, placing it in his hands. "Correct," confirmed Reed, checking his list. Darwin was indeed the purple monkey. The silence in the room was deafening. The scientists looked at each other. They had just witnessed something that psychology textbooks said was impossible. A non-human animal demonstrating genuine understanding of abstract symbolic language. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 3 hours, Chaser would be tested with dozens of objects in different configurations with different commands, and she would get almost all of them right. To understand the magnitude of what was happening in that laboratory, we need to go back in time, far back. We need to understand where these extraordinary dogs came from and how a chance encounter between a retired professor and a puppy would change our understanding of the limits of the animal mind. The story of Border Collies begins in the mists of time, in the borderlands between Scotland and England, a region known as the Borders. It was a place of wild and brutal beauty, where rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, covered by a green carpet that hid treacherous rocks and deep ravines. The climate was unforgiving. Torrential rains could turn to blizzards in a matter of hours, and the cutting winds from the North Sea could knock down an unprepared man. In this hostile environment, for centuries, shepherds struggled to survive. Their lives depended entirely on their flocks of sheep, animals that provided wool for clothing, milk for cheese, and meat for the long winters. Losing even a small portion of the flock could mean the difference between life and death for an entire family. The shepherds needed help, and they found it in dogs, but not just any dogs. The extreme conditions of the borders demanded something special. The dogs needed to be hardy enough to work all day in brutal conditions, intelligent enough to make independent decisions when out of voice range of the shepherd, and gentle enough not to harm the valuable sheep. For generations, shepherds carefully bred their best working dogs. There were no breed clubs or written standards, just the brutal selection of necessity. Dogs that couldn't do the work didn't survive to breed. Dogs that excelled were carefully mated in hopes of passing on their abilities. One of the first written accounts of these extraordinary dogs comes from 1570. James Hogg, a shepherd in the Tweed Valley, kept a detailed diary of his life in the hills. In a particularly dramatic entry dated October 15th, he wrote, "A terrible storm fell upon us without warning. The sky darkened like night at noon, and the wind howled like the demons of hell. I could see my sheep, all 300 of them, running in panic toward the Black Base cliffs. I ran as fast as I could, but I knew it was useless. I would lose half the flock before I could reach them. It was then that Hemp, my black and white dog, did something I still cannot fully comprehend. He didn't run straight for the sheep as any dog would. Instead, he traced a great arc, running faster than I'd ever seen him run, and somehow appeared on the other side of the flock, between them and the cliff. Then he did the strangest thing. He lay down and stared at them. He didn't bark, didn't move, just stared with those strange eyes of his, and by God, all 300 sheep stopped as if they'd been turned to stone. They stood there, trembling, until I arrived and guided them to safety. Hemp saved my entire flock and probably my life, with nothing but a look. This look that Hogg described would become legendary. Shepherds began calling it the Eye, and it became the defining characteristic of these border dogs. It was an intense, almost hypnotic stare that seemed to penetrate the soul of the sheep and bend them to the dog's will. Modern scientists now understand this is a modified hunting behavior, the fixed stare a predator uses before attacking. But in Border Collies, the instinct to bite has been suppressed, leaving only the power of the gaze. For the next 3 centuries, these border dogs remained a well-kept secret of the remote hills. Occasionally, a traveler would return with stories of dogs that could control enormous flocks with supernatural precision, but these stories were usually dismissed as exaggerations. This changed in 1873 with the first sheepdog trial held in Bala, Wales. The competition was the idea of R.J. Lloyd Price, a landowner who had witnessed these dogs working and was convinced the public would be amazed by their abilities. He was right. 10,000 people attended to watch, an enormous crowd for the time. What they saw left them speechless. Dog after dog demonstrated abilities that seemed impossible. They moved sheep through complex courses, separated specific sheep from the flock, and responded to whistles and hand signals from hundreds of yards away. But it was a dog named Tweed who stole the show. His handler stood on the opposite side of a 10-acre field, and using only whistles, guided Tweed to gather 50 scattered sheep, move them through a series of gates, separate them into 2 groups by color, and then reunite them in a pen, all in less than 15 minutes. The London Times covered the event, and their correspondent wrote, "Had I not seen it with my own eyes, I would have considered the report's fantasy. These dogs demonstrate an intelligence that defies explanation. They seem to understand not just commands, but intentions. They anticipate problems and solve them independently. They are, in a word, extraordinary." But even these remarkable dogs would pale in comparison to what was to come. In 1893, on a modest farm in Northumberland, a puppy was born who would forever change the breed and set the standard by which all future Border Collies would be measured. His name was Old Hemp. Adam Telfer, Hemp's owner, was a shepherd of few words and much experience. He had carefully bred his bitch Meg, known for her sharp intelligence, with Roy, a strong male with excellent stamina. But even Telfer wasn't prepared for what he had created. Hemp was different from the start. While his littermates played and wrestled like normal puppies, Hemp watched. He studied the sheep through the fence, his head tilted as if he were deciphering a complex puzzle. At just 6 weeks old, he began displaying herding behaviors, circling his sisters and attempting to move them as a group. At 6 months, Hemp entered his first competition. The experienced judges, many of whom had worked with sheepdogs their entire lives, were stunned. The young dog moved with an economy of motion they had never seen, while other dogs ran frantically, barking and wasting energy. Hemp glided across the field like a shadow. He never barked. He didn't need to. His gaze was enough. One judge wrote in his notes, "Mr. Telfer's dog works in a manner I cannot adequately describe. It is as if he can see the entire field from above, like a general surveying a battlefield. He is always exactly where he needs to be, often before the sheep even realize they're going to try to escape. In 30 years of judging dogs, I have never seen anything like it." Hemp competed in trials for only a few years, but he dominated completely. He never lost. More importantly, he passed on his extraordinary abilities to his offspring. Hemp sired over 200 puppies during his lifetime, and his descendants swept competitions throughout Britain. It wasn't long before it became almost impossible to find a successful sheepdog that didn't have Hemp in its lineage. But Hemp gave more than just physical ability to his descendants. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that he carried a unique combination of genes affecting brain development. These genes, now fixed in the breed, result in brains with significantly more neural connections than other dogs. It's as if Hemp gave his descendants more powerful computers to work with. Of course, with great power comes great responsibility and problems. The same genes that gave Hemp's descendants their extraordinary intelligence also made them prone to certain conditions. Collie eye anomaly, a condition that can lead to blindness, appeared with increasing frequency. Epilepsy became common, and perhaps most significantly, these super-intelligent dogs began showing signs of what we can only call mental health problems when they didn't receive enough mental stimulation. As the 20th century progressed, Border Collies began spreading beyond their native hills. Farmers in Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas heard about these miracle dogs and began importing them, but it was in North America that the next chapter of their story would be written. In 1995, a psychologist named Dr. Stanley Corren from the University of British Columbia decided to definitively answer a question that had intrigued dog lovers for generations. Which breeds are the most intelligent? He developed a rigorous methodology, surveying 208 obedience trial judges from the American Kennel Club and Canadian Kennel Club. These judges had collectively evaluated thousands of dogs from 140 different breeds. Corren asked the judges to rank breeds based on 3 types of intelligence: instinctive, what the dog was bred to do; adaptive, how well the dog solves problems; and working, obedience, how quickly the dog learns from humans. The results were tabulated and statistically analyzed. When Corin saw the final results, he recalculated 3 times, not because the results were close, but because they weren't. The Border Collie wasn't just at the top of the list, it was in a statistical category of its own. The difference between Border Collies and the second most intelligent breed, Poodles, was greater than the difference between second and 10th. It was like discovering that one species of dog had an IQ of 180 while all the others were around 100. Corin would later explain in an interview, "Statistically, it was such an extreme outlier that I initially thought there must be some error in the data, but there was no error. Border Collies consistently learned new commands in fewer than 5 repetitions and obeyed the first command 95% of the time or better. To put this in perspective, the average breed needed 25-40 repetitions to learn a new command and obeyed the first command only 50% of the time." Corin's book, The Intelligence of Dogs, became a bestseller, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about these genius dogs. It was in this environment of growing fascination with canine intelligence that the next major breakthrough would occur, not in a laboratory or university, but in a small town in Germany. In 2002, a German housewife named Susanne Baus contacted the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. She claimed that her 9-year-old Border Collie Rico knew the names of over 200 toys. The scientists at the institute, led by Dr. Julian Kaminski, were skeptical. While dogs could clearly learn to associate sounds with actions, like sit or stay, the idea that a dog could learn nouns, names for objects, the same way human children learn vocabulary seemed unlikely. But Kaminski was a scientist, and scientists test claims rather than dismiss them. She and her team traveled to Baus's home and set up a series of rigorous experiments. Rico and his toys were placed in one room, while Baus stayed in another room, unable to give any visual cues to the dog. The first test was straightforward. 10 of Rico's toys were scattered around the room. From the other room, Baus called, "Rico, where is Mr. Tiger?" Without hesitation, Rico picked up a stuffed tiger. "Rico, bring Mrs. B." Rico brought a stuffed bee. One by one, Rico correctly identified all 10 toys. Impressive, but Kaminski suspected there might be simpler explanations. Perhaps Rico was responding to subtle cues in his owner's tone of voice. Perhaps certain sounds naturally matched certain toys. She needed to dig deeper. The next experiment was more revealing. Kaminski placed 7 toys that Rico knew well in a room, along with one completely new toy he had never seen before. Then Baus asked Rico to fetch an item using a word he had never heard. "Rico, where is Siegfried?" Rico entered the room and paused. He looked at each of the familiar toys in turn, clearly recognizing them. Then his gaze settled on the new toy, a small stuffed Santa. He sniffed it cautiously, picked it up, and brought it to his owner. Kaminski could barely believe it. Rico had demonstrated a cognitive ability called fast mapping, the ability to form a quick, rough association between a word and an object through logical exclusion. It's exactly how young children learn new words. If Mum points to a table with an apple, a banana, and an unknown fruit and says, "Get the kiwi," the child deduces that kiwi must be the unknown fruit. But Kaminski needed to be sure. She tested Rico repeatedly with different new objects and different new words. The results were consistent. Rico could learn new words in a single exposure and, more impressively, remember them weeks later. When the study was published in the prestigious journal Science in 2004, it caused a sensation. The popular press loved the story of the genius dog, but the scientific implications were profound. Rico had demonstrated that the ability for fast word learning was not uniquely human. This raised fundamental questions about the nature of language and cognition. Across the Atlantic, a retired psychology professor read about Rico with great interest. John Pilley had taught psychology at Wofford College for 30 years before retiring. At 76, he was enjoying a quiet retirement with his wife Sally at their home in Spartanburg, South Carolina. But retirement didn't sit well with Pilley's restless mind. John was becoming impossible, Sally would later recall. He had spent his whole life working with ideas and students, and suddenly he had nothing to challenge his mind. He was reorganizing the garage for the 3rd time when I suggested maybe we needed a dog. Sally's suggestion was practical. She thought a dog would give John something to do, someone to take for walks. But when Pilley read about Rico, an idea began to form. What if he could replicate the study? Better yet, what if he could expand it? Rico knew 200 words. How far could a dog's word-learning capacity really go? In 2004, the Pilleys brought home an 8-week-old Border Collie puppy. They named her Chaser because from day one she loved to chase anything that moved. But Pilley had bigger plans for her than just fetching balls. Pilley approached Chaser's training with the rigor of a scientist and the patience of an experienced teacher. He developed a systematic methodology. Each day he would introduce a new object with a unique name. He would show the object to Chaser, say its name clearly, they would play with it together, and then he would hide it among others and ask her to find it. But Pilley went beyond simple name recognition. He wanted to see if Chaser could understand categories categories, abstract concepts that group similar objects together. So some toys were balls, anything that bounced, some were frisbees, anything flat that could be thrown, and some were simply toys, a general category for all play objects. Initial progress was slow but steady. At 5 months, Chaser knew 50 words. Pilly kept meticulous records, testing her regularly to ensure she had truly learned each word and wasn't just guessing. But around 7 months of age, something remarkable happened. Chaser began learning faster. It was like watching a child suddenly get reading, Pilly would write in his notes. Suddenly she understood that these sounds I was making were names and that everything could have a name. From that point on, she began learning new words faster and faster. At 1 year old, Chaser knew over 200 words, matching Rico. But Pilly wasn't satisfied. He continued, hour after hour, day after day. Their routine was relentless. 4 to 5 hours of training per day, every day. For many dogs, this would be tedious, but for Chaser, it was heaven. Border Collies are work addicts, and learning words had become Chaser's job. Sally Pilly watched with a mixture of amusement and concern as their house filled with toys. We had toys everywhere, she recalled. In the basement, in the attic, in every closet. John organized them obsessively by category and kept detailed lists. Our grandchildren loved visiting. It was like coming to a toy store. At 2 years old, Chaser knew 800 words. Pilly began to wonder if there was a limit. He consulted with child psychologists and learned that the average 3-year-old knows about 1,000 words. That became his goal. Could a dog match the vocabulary of a young child? But Pilly wasn't interested in just numbers. He wanted to understand the depth of Chaser's comprehension. He began teaching her verbs beyond simple fetch. Chaser learned to paw objects with her foot, take with her mouth, bring objects to other objects, and put objects on top of or next to others. Then came the combination of nouns and verbs. Chaser take ball was different from Chaser paw ball, which was different from Chaser take ball to frisbee. This required Chaser to understand not just individual words, but syntax, the structure of language. The tests Pilly devised became increasingly sophisticated. He would place 3 objects in a room, say a ball, a frisbee, and a rope. Then he would give Chaser a series of commands: paw frisbee, take ball, bring rope. Chaser had to remember all 3 commands in order and execute them correctly. You could see her processing, described Robin, Pilly's daughter. Her eyes would move between the objects, almost as if she were mentally rehearsing the commands. Then she'd execute the sequence perfectly. It was incredible to watch. In 2008, with Chaser knowing over 1,000 words, Pilly realized he needed independent scientific verification. He contacted colleagues in the psychology community, and soon a team of researchers was on their way to Spartanburg. The formal test was designed to be absolutely rigorous. The researchers randomly selected objects from Chaser's enormous vocabulary. Pilly was blindfolded, so he couldn't give inadvertent visual cues. Chaser had to retrieve objects from another room, ensuring she wasn't responding to subtle signals. Over 3 days, Chaser was tested repeatedly. Objects she hadn't seen in months were requested. The words were spoken by different people with different accents. Commands were given in different orders and combinations, and through it all, Chaser performed nearly perfectly. But the most impressive test came when the researchers decided to test Chaser's understanding of categories. They placed a mixture of objects in a room. Some were Chaser's toys, others were common household objects she had never seen before. Then they asked, Chaser, find a toy. Chaser entered the room and began systematically examining the objects. She sniffed a shoe and passed it by. She touched a book with her nose and ignored it. But when she found one of her toys, she picked it up and brought it back. Repeatedly, she correctly identified only her toys, ignoring the non-toys. This was profound. Chaser wasn't just memorizing associations between sounds and objects. She understood that toy was a category, an abstract concept that encompassed many different objects based on their function, not their appearance. When the results were published in 2011 in the journal Behavioral Processes, the scientific world took notice. Chaser hadn't just broken Rico's record, she had shattered it. Her 1,022 words represented a vocabulary larger than that of many 2-year-old children. But more important than the numbers was the quality of her understanding. While Chaser was redefining the limits of canine cognition in a laboratory, other Border Collies were demonstrating their extraordinary abilities in the real world, often in life or death situations. On the morning of September 11, 2001, when the unthinkable happened in New York, search and rescue teams from across the country rushed to help. Among them was James Symington, a search and rescue officer from Nova Scotia, and his 5-year-old partner, a Border Collie named Blitz. Blitz had been trained in search and rescue since he was a puppy, but nothing could have prepared him for the devastation of Ground Zero. The air was thick with dust and smoke. The noise was deafening: sirens, heavy machinery, shouting workers. The smell was overwhelming, a toxic mixture of pulverized concrete, burned metal, and worse. Many dogs just shut down, Symington recalled years later, his voice still heavy with the memory. The sensory overload was too much. Dogs that were stars in training were overwhelmed and had to be pulled out. But Blitz, Blitz did something I'd never seen before. Rather than searching randomly or becoming overwhelmed, Blitz developed his own system. He would mentally divide an area into a grid and search it methodically, marking locations of interest with a paw before moving on. After covering the entire area, he would return to the marked locations in order of priority. He was doing triage, Symington explained, like an emergency room doctor deciding which patients to treat first. He was somehow categorizing the scents and sounds he was detecting and making decisions about which were most likely to indicate survivors. For 37 straight hours, Blitz worked the rubble. Other dogs were rotated out every few hours, exhausted physically and mentally, but Blitz refused to stop, and Symington trusted him enough to let him continue. It was at hour 37 that Blitz made his most important discovery. He was re-examining an area he had covered hours before when he suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, his posture changed. He began digging frantically at a specific spot, ignoring Symington's commands to wait for the excavation team. "I'd never seen him so determined," Symington said. "He was digging like his life depended on it." We called in the excavation team and they began carefully removing debris where Blitz had indicated. 15 feet down, in a small pocket of space created by fallen beams, they found Janelle Guzman, badly injured but alive. She had been trapped for over 27 hours and would be the last person rescued alive from the rubble. How did Blitz know? The area had been checked before with no result. Symington has a theory. "I think something changed. Maybe the temperature dropped enough that he could detect her body heat, or maybe she made some small sound only he could hear." But he remembered that area was slightly different than before, and that made him check again. That kind of comparative memory, that ability to note subtle changes over time, it's extraordinary. Blitz's story is just one of many. In Montana in 2012, a search and rescue border collie named Meg demonstrated problem-solving abilities that left even experienced handlers amazed. Two children, ages 6 and 8, had been lost in dense forest for 20 hours. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and search teams were becoming desperate. Meg was brought to the children's last known location. She sniffed around, picking up the scent, and then did something unexpected. Instead of following the scent trail in the direction the children had gone, she paused, seemed to calculate for a moment, and then took off running in the completely opposite direction. "I thought she'd lost her mind," admitted Carol, Meg's handler. "She was going 180 degrees in the wrong direction. Some of the other searchers started yelling that she was wrong, that we should call in another dog. But I'd known Meg for 8 years. She never did anything without a reason." Carol trusted her dog and followed. 2 hours later, Meg found the children, cold and scared but unharmed, huddled under a large fallen tree. They were nearly 3 miles from the last known location, in the opposite direction from where they'd started. How did Meg know where to look? Post-analysis of the children's trail revealed the answer. The children had indeed walked in the direction the search teams expected for about a mile. But then, confused and frightened in the dark, they had begun walking in circles, eventually doubling back and passing their starting point in the opposite direction. Meg had somehow calculated this. She factored in the typical pattern of lost people. Statistically, lost children almost always turn left. The topography of the terrain. There was a stream that would have acted as a barrier in one direction. The wind direction over the past 20 hours, which would have affected how the scent trail dispersed. The elapsed time, how far the children could have traveled. She created a mental model of where the children were likely to be, explained a search and rescue expert who analyzed the case. This requires not just tracking a scent, but understanding human behavior, environmental physics, and probability. It's the kind of complex, abstract thinking we associate with humans, not dogs. While some border collies were saving lives in dramatic situations, others were changing lives in quieter but equally profound ways. In 2016 in Colorado, Nancy Peterson was living what she described as a half-life. At 34, she had developed severe epilepsy after a car accident. The seizures came without warning, making it impossible to drive, work, or even leave the house alone. "I was a prisoner in my own body," Nancy explained. "I never knew when a seizure would hit. I'd broken bones falling, burned myself in the kitchen, nearly drowned in the bath. My life had shrunk to the confines of my apartment." Her neurologist suggested a service dog, but Nancy was skeptical. She'd heard of dogs that could detect seizures, but they were rare and expensive. Through a series of fortunate events, she ended up meeting Storm, a 2-year-old border collie who had been returned to a breeder because he was too intense for his previous family. Storm had no formal training as a seizure detection dog. In fact, many experts believed such training was impossible. The ability to detect seizures seemed to be something some dogs had naturally, not something that could be taught. But Storm had something special. Within a week of living with Nancy, Storm began acting strangely. About 20 minutes before Nancy would have a seizure, he would become restless. He would paw at her, whine softly, and try to guide her to the couch or bed. At first, "I thought it was coincidence," Nancy said. But then it happened again and again. He knew. Somehow he knew. Intrigued, Nancy's neurologist began documenting Storm's behavior. What they discovered was remarkable. Storm was detecting extremely subtle changes that preceded Nancy's seizures. Minute changes in body odor caused by pre-seizure chemical changes. Micro-expressions Nancy wasn't aware of. Small changes in her movement patterns and posture. But Storm didn't stop there. On his own, he began developing different responses for different types of seizures. For small seizures, he would simply stay close to Nancy and guide her to safety. But for grand mal seizures, he would open the apartment door to allow neighbors to enter if needed, activate a special alarm Nancy had installed, remove dangerous objects from Nancy's path. After the seizure, bring her water and medication. He created his own protocols, Nancy's neurologist explained, amazed. No one taught him to do these things. He observed, learned, and developed a complex system of responses based on his observations. It's problem-solving at a level we rarely see even in humans. Nancy's life was transformed. With Storm's 20-minute warning, she could prepare for seizures, getting to a safe place and alerting others if necessary. She returned to work, began driving again, with Storm always in the car, and even started traveling. Storm doesn't just detect my seizures, Nancy said, tears in her eyes. He gave me my life back. As stories like Storm's spread, researchers began studying Border Collies more systematically, trying to understand the neurological basis of their extraordinary abilities. What they discovered was fascinating and sometimes disturbing. Brain imaging studies revealed that Border Collies have approximately 30% more neural connections in key brain areas compared to other dog breeds. Specifically, they show increased development in the MAUs, prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and decision-making, hippocampus, crucial for memory and spatial navigation, temporal cortex, involved in language processing. It's like they have upgraded hardware, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist at Stanford University who led one of the studies. But it's not just about having more connections, it's about how those connections are organized. Border Collie brains show patterns of connectivity that are remarkably similar to those seen in higher primates. Even more intriguing was the discovery that Border Collies appear to use parallel processing, the ability to work on multiple problems simultaneously. In an ingenious experiment, researchers gave Border Collies two different tasks to perform at the same time, navigating a maze while also memorizing a sequence of objects. While other breeds had to switch between tasks, showing decreased performance, Border Collies seemed to process both simultaneously without loss of efficiency. These findings caught the attention of artificial intelligence researchers. In 2022, a team from MIT decided to test Border Collies against their most advanced AI algorithms in a series of cognitive challenges. The results were humbling for the computer scientists. Tesla, a 4-year-old Border Collie from Boston, competed against cutting-edge AI in pattern recognition in visual datasets, solving novel problems with changing rules, adapting to dynamic environments. Tesla won decisively in all categories, but it wasn't just that he won, it was how he won. The AI used brute computational force, analyzing millions of possibilities. Tesla seemed to intuit solutions, often finding shortcuts the programmers had never considered. The most frustrating part, admitted Dr. Michael Torres, who led the MIT project, was when we changed the rules mid-test. Our AI needed to be completely reprogrammed. Tesla just paused for about 3 seconds, seemed to think about it, and then adapted perfectly. He was rewriting his own algorithms in real time. But perhaps the most touching application of Border Collie intelligence emerged from an unlikely pilot program in San Diego in 2021. Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychologist specializing in autism spectrum disorders, had noticed something interesting. Many of her young patients seemed to connect with dogs in ways they couldn't with humans. Children who avoided all eye contact were suddenly looking into dogs' eyes, she explained. Non-verbal children who hadn't spoken in years were murmuring to dogs. There was something happening that I didn't fully understand. Dr. Kim launched a pilot study pairing specially trained Border Collies with children on the autism spectrum. The results exceeded even her most optimistic hopes. 70% reduction in self-harming behaviors, significant improvement in eye contact and social interaction. Several nonverbal children began speaking, initially only to the dog. Measurable reduction in anxiety levels. But why Border Collies specifically? Dr. Kim's theory was fascinating. Border Collies and people on the autism spectrum process the world similarly, intensely, with great attention to detail, and very logically. They don't rely on the subtle social cues that can be so confusing for autistic individuals. Instead, they're direct, consistent, and predictable, while still being responsive and intelligent. One particularly moving case involved an 8-year-old boy named Marcus who hadn't spoken a word in 4 years. He was paired with a Border Collie named Luna. For weeks, nothing changed. Marcus would sit near Luna but wouldn't interact. Then one day, Luna brought a ball to Marcus and placed it in his lap. Marcus picked it up and threw it. The first initiated action he'd taken in months. Luna brought the ball back. This time, when Marcus threw it, he whispered something so quietly it was almost lost. Go. It was like a dam had burst, Marcus's mother recalled through tears. Within weeks, he was giving Luna full commands. Then he started telling us what Luna was thinking. And then, finally, he started talking to us directly. Luna somehow provided the bridge he needed. As our understanding of Border Collie capabilities expanded, so did our awareness of the responsibilities that came with breeding such intelligent dogs. Dr. James Serpell of the University of Pennsylvania, one of the world's leading experts on canine behavior, raised provocative ethical questions. We're breeding minds that may be approaching sentience as we define it philosophically, he argued in a controversial paper. At what point do we need to reconsider how we think about these animals? If a dog can learn language, solve complex problems, show empathy, and even develop its own systems for understanding the world, what ethical obligations do we have? The question isn't purely academic. With great intelligence comes great capacity for suffering. Veterinary behaviorists report that Border Collies are disproportionately represented in cases of OCD-like disorders, severe anxiety, and even what can only be described as clinical depression. The case of Shadow, a Border Collie from Seattle, illustrates the problem. Adopted by a well-meaning family who underestimated his needs, Shadow began exhibiting increasingly disturbing behaviors. He wasn't being destructive in the traditional sense. He was trying to create order in a world that didn't give him enough problems to solve. I came home to find all my books removed from the shelves and arranged by size on the floor, his owner, Sarah Mitchell, reported. All the kitchen drawers were open with contents categorized in piles. He'd somehow opened the refrigerator and lined up all the food by color and size. It wasn't destruction. It was a desperate cry for mental stimulation. Shadow was eventually rehabilitated through an intensive program that gave him complex puzzles to solve, elaborate tricks to learn, and even volunteer work at a nursing home where he learned to respond to different residents' specific needs. But many Border Collies aren't so lucky. We see Border Collies who have developed what I can only describe as boredom-induced psychosis, explained Dr. Karen Overall, a veterinary behaviorist. They chase shadows for hours, become catatonic staring at walls, or develop elaborate rituals they must perform or they panic. It's heartbreaking because these are brilliant minds trapped in situations that can't utilize their capabilities. As we grapple with these ethical questions, science continues to reveal new dimensions of Border Collie abilities. One of the most intriguing developments came from a 2018 study at the University of Edinburgh that suggested Border Collies may have capabilities that border on what we might popularly call psychic. The study, led by Dr. Elizabeth Walsh, was investigating how quickly Border Collies could respond to commands. They measured both the handler's brain activity using EEG and the dog's response time. What they discovered left them puzzled. In a statistically significant number of trials, the dog began responding to the command before the handler had fully formed the intention to give it. The difference was small, about 0.3 seconds, Dr. Walsh explained, but it was consistent and measurable. It was as if the dogs were somehow picking up on the intention to give a command before it was fully formed in the handler's mind. The most likely explanation is that Border Collies are reading extremely subtle signals, perhaps changes in posture, micro-expressions, or even alterations in scent caused by changing mental states. But some cases defy even these explanations. Consider the documented case of Jess, a Border Collie in New Zealand. On 3 separate occasions between 2017 and 2019, Jess woke her family in the middle of the night and insisted they leave the house. She even dragged blankets and pillows into the yard. On each occasion, a significant earthquake occurred 30 to 60 minutes later. Seismologists studied the case extensively. The leading theory is that Jess was detecting earthquake precursors, perhaps minute changes in the Earth's electromagnetic field, or ultra-low frequency vibrations undetectable by human instruments. But the specificity of her predictions and the timing involved remain a mystery. Even more puzzling was the case of Betsy, reported by a farming family in Australia in 2020. Betsy developed a peculiar behavior of going to the farm gate every day at 4 p.m. and waiting. The problem was that no one came at 4 p.m. The family was puzzled but dismissed it as a quirk. 3 weeks later, they received news that their son, serving in Afghanistan, had been injured in an IED attack. When they converted the time of the injury to Australian time, it was exactly 4 p.m. Betsy somehow knew or sensed that something significant was happening to a family member thousands of miles away. We don't have a scientific framework to explain this, admitted Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, a biologist who has studied such phenomena. Either we dismiss it as coincidence or we begin to consider that there may be aspects of consciousness and connection we don't yet understand. As we debate the philosophical implications of Border Collie intelligence, practical applications continue to expand. In 2023, 2023, Border Collies are being used in medical fields with success rates that exceed technology, detecting cancer with 95% accuracy through scent, identifying COVID-19 with 92% accuracy, alerting to Parkinson's onset years before clinical symptoms. But most revolutionary is that these dogs are teaching scientists how they do it. Stella, a Border Collie working with researchers at Harvard, demonstrated how she categorizes scents by creating what her handler describes as 3D smell maps in her mind. She showed us that she's not just detecting the presence or absence of specific compounds, explained Dr. Claire Morrison, who leads the study. She's creating complex multidimensional profiles that include concentration, relationships between different compounds, and even changes over time. It's a level of sensory processing we're only beginning to understand. This understanding is leading to the development of new medical diagnostic devices based on Border Collie detection methods. But as Dr. Morrison notes, our best efforts are still generations behind what these dogs can do naturally. It's humbling. As we look to the future, it's clear that Border Collies are at the forefront of a fundamental shift in how we understand animal intelligence. Reports from breeders around the world suggest the breed continues to evolve, with puppies demonstrating abilities that would have been considered impossible just a generation ago. We're seeing puppies that seem to understand complex syntax without training, reported Margaret Holmes, a breeder with 40 years of experience. I had a litter where a 12-week-old puppy figured out how to open a combination lock by watching me do it 3 times. Another puppy from the same litter seems to understand basic numerical concepts. She can distinguish between groups of 2, 3, or 4 objects and respond appropriately. Dr. Serpell, ever provocative, raises a question that may sound like science fiction, but is becoming increasingly relevant. If Border Collie cognitive abilities continue to advance at this rate, in 50 years, we may be dealing with the first non-human species that demands consideration for cognitive rights. It sounds extreme now, but it also sounded extreme to suggest a dog could learn 1,000 words. But amid all the science and speculation, it's important to remember the heart of what makes Border Collies so extraordinary. Let's return to Chaser, whose story began this journey. In her final years, Chaser became more than just a research subject. She became a symbol of what's possible when minds meet across species barriers. Dr. Pilly often took Chaser to schools and demonstrated her abilities to children. But what resonated most wasn't her impressive vocabulary, it was her obvious joy in learning and communicating. The children understood something we adults sometimes miss, Pilly reflected in one of his last interviews. They saw that Chaser wasn't performing tricks. She was having a conversation with us. She had things she wanted to say, and we had finally given her a way to say them. In 2018, when Chaser was 15 and visibly weakening, Pilly conducted one last unofficial experiment. He spread some of Chaser's favorite toys around the room and asked her, "Chaser, which is your favorite? Show me your favorite." Chaser stood slowly. Arthritis had taken its toll and walked around the room. She paused at various toys, sniffing them gently as if remembering. Then she went to the table where Pilly kept his research notes. There, partially hidden under some papers, was a photograph, a picture of Pilly himself taken years earlier during one of their training sessions. Chaser gently picked up the photograph with her mouth and brought it to Pilly, placing it in his hands and looking into his eyes. "She understood the question at a level I hadn't intended," Pilly said later, his voice thick with emotion. "I asked about her favorite toy, and she told me I was her favorite. She understood that our relationship, our work together, our learning games, that was her favorite play." Chaser passed away peacefully on July 23, 2019, at age 15. Pilly, who had died a year earlier at 89, had ensured Chaser would be cared for until the end. Her brain was donated to science, where it continues to provide insights into the neurological basis of her extraordinary abilities. But Chaser's legacy extends far beyond scientific papers and brain studies. She, along with Rico, Blitz, Storm, and countless other Border Collies, proved definitively that the line between human and animal intelligence is not a chasm, but a continuum. They showed that other minds can think, plan, feel, and even dream in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. Today, as you listen to this story, there are Border Collies around the world continuing this legacy. They are saving lives in disaster zones, detecting diseases before any machine can, helping children find their voices, guiding the blind, comforting the lonely, protecting flocks as their ancestors did centuries ago, and yes, learning new words, solving new problems, and showing us new ways to understand intelligence. But perhaps most importantly, they're doing what Border Collies have always done best. They're working. Because to a Border Collie, work isn't drudgery. Work is purpose. Work is joy. Work is love in action. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson these extraordinary dogs have to teach us. Intelligence without purpose is empty. Knowledge without application is useless. But when you combine a brilliant mind with a dedicated heart and give it meaningful work to do, whether that's learning 1,000 words, saving lives, or simply being the best friend anyone ever had, that's when real magic happens. Border Collies show us that genius isn't about how much you know. It's about how much you care. It's about taking every ounce of ability you have and using it to make the world a better place. It's about looking at someone you love, whether human or dog, and saying through your actions, I'm here. I'm paying attention, and I'm going to use everything I have to help. In the end, perhaps the smartest thing about Border Collies is this. With all their impressive cognitive abilities, with their ability to outsmart computers and learn languages and predict earthquakes, the only word that really matters to them, the only one they truly care to understand completely, is the simplest one of all: home. Wherever you are, because that's where their work is, and for a Border Collie, there's nowhere in the world they'd rather be. This is the true story of Border Collies, not just the world's smartest dogs, but teachers, partners, and living proof that the brightest minds are those that shine not for themselves, but to light the way for others. And somewhere right now, at this very moment, a Border Collie is looking at their human with those intense, intelligent eyes, ready to learn, ready to work, ready to love, because that's what they do. That's what they are. The four-legged geniuses, the teachers who never speak, the friends who always understand, the Border Collies, the species that taught us that true intelligence isn't measured in words learned or problems solved, but in love given, work well done, and lives changed for the better. And that lesson, perhaps, is the smartest one of all.